They pushed me toward assisted living. I moved first, built a legal fortress, and delivered a final ultimatum that blew their plan apart. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was tending to my rose garden, the same garden my late wife Eleanor had planted 37 years ago. I should have known something was wrong when I heard David's voice, that careful tone he used when he was about to deliver news he knew would hurt me. "Dad, we need to talk about your living situation. You're getting older, and Mom's been gone for 2 years now. Maybe it's time to consider something more manageable." I set down my pruning shears, feeling the familiar weight of loneliness settle over me like morning fog. At 74, I'd been living alone in our family home since Eleanor's passing, managing just fine despite what my son seemed to think. The house held 40 years of memories, from David's first steps in the kitchen to Eleanor's last Christmas morning, opening presents by the fireplace I'd built with my own hands. "What exactly are you suggesting, son?" I asked, though I already sensed where this conversation was heading. "There's this wonderful assisted living facility called Sunset Manor. Very upscale, excellent care, activities for seniors. Sarah and I went to look at it yesterday, and we think it would be perfect for you." Sarah, my daughter-in-law, who'd never quite warmed to me, who'd spent 15 years making subtle comments about the house being too old, too big, too much work for someone my age. I'd always bitten my tongue for David's sake, but now it seemed her influence had finally won. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself and this house. This is my home, David. Your mother and I built our life here." "But Dad, be realistic. You're 74. What if something happens? What if you fall and no one finds you for days? We worry about you constantly." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with David presenting what sounded like a carefully rehearsed argument. He'd done his research, talked to financial advisors, even consulted with a real estate agent about the house's current market value. $850,000, he mentioned casually, as if the number meant nothing more than the price of groceries. After I hung up, I sat in Eleanor's favorite chair by the window, watching the afternoon light filter through the lace curtains she'd sewn by hand. The house felt different somehow, as if David's words had changed the very air inside these walls. For the first time since Eleanor's death, I truly felt old. Over the next few weeks, the pressure intensified. David and Sarah visited twice, each time bringing brochures for Sunset Manor, highlighting the amenities, the medical staff on site, the social activities that would keep me busy and engaged. They painted a picture of golden years filled with new friendships and worry-free living, all while carefully avoiding any mention of what would happen to the house. But I wasn't born yesterday, and 45 years in construction had taught me to read between the lines. During one particularly tense dinner at their house, I overheard a phone conversation between Sarah and her sister that made everything crystal clear. "Once we get him settled at Sunset Manor, we can put the house on the market immediately. David thinks we should list it at $850, but I say we price it to move fast. $900,000, take the first decent offer. With the money from the sale, we can finally buy that lake house we've been looking at." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. They weren't concerned about my welfare or my safety. They saw dollar signs where I saw home, investment opportunity where I saw irreplaceable memories. My son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike in our driveway, was planning to sell my life out from under me. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the house around me. 40 years of mortgage payments, 40 years of repairs and improvements, 40 years of love poured into every room. Eleanor and I had scraped together the down payment when David was just 2 years old, working double shifts and saving every penny to make this dream a reality. I remembered the day we'd closed on the property, how Eleanor had cried when she turned the key for the first time. We'd furnished it piece by piece, painting each room together, planning every detail with the careful attention of people who knew they were building something permanent. This wasn't just a house to us. It was the foundation of our family, the place where we'd raised our son and created a lifetime of precious memories. But David saw none of that now. To him, it was simply an asset to be liquidated, a means to fund his own dreams while warehousing his inconvenient father in a facility where he wouldn't have to worry about me anymore. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just angry, but determined. If they wanted to play games with my future, they were about to discover that this old man still had a few moves left. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Frank Morrison, who'd handled our family's legal affairs for 20 years. We'd served together on the church board, and I trusted him implicitly. Frank listened patiently as I explained the situation, his occasional, and I see telling me he understood the implications perfectly. "Harold," he said when I'd finished, "I hate to say this, but what you're describing is more common than you'd think. Adult children often assume they know what's best for their aging parents, especially when valuable assets are involved. But legally speaking, as long as you're of sound mind, which you clearly are, they can't force you to do anything." That's exactly what I wanted to hear. "Frank, I need you to help me with something that will ensure my son learns a valuable lesson about respect and assumptions." Over the next hour, we discussed my options. Frank explained the legal protections available to me, the steps I could take to secure my property and my future. By the time I left his office, I had a plan that would teach David and Sarah exactly who they were dealing with. They thought they were manipulating a helpless old man, but they were about to discover that Harold Mitchell had spent 74 years learning how to take care of himself. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. David and Sarah assumed I was technologically helpless, that I couldn't navigate modern banking or legal procedures without their assistance. They'd made the classic mistake of underestimating their opponent, and that overconfidence would be their downfall. That evening, David called again, his voice carrying that same patronizing tone that had become so familiar. "Dad, Sarah and I have been thinking. Maybe we should schedule a tour of Sunset Manor for this weekend, just to look around, get a feel for the place. No pressure, just exploring options." I smiled, settling deeper into my recliner. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, son. I'd love to see what you found for me." The relief in his voice was palpable. "Really? That's great, Dad. I think you're going to love it there. The people are so friendly, and the facilities are top-notch. You'll have your own apartment, but with all the services you need right there." As he described the amenities and advantages of assisted living, I found myself oddly calm. For weeks, these conversations had filled me with dread and anger. Now, knowing what I knew and having set my own plan in motion, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: control. For the first time since Eleanor's death, I was the one making decisions about my future. After we hung up, I walked through my house slowly, room by room, seeing it with new eyes. Tomorrow, I would begin implementing the plan Frank and I had devised. By the time David and Sarah realized what was happening, it would be far too late to stop me. They wanted to treat me like a helpless old man who could be managed and manipulated. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The irony wasn't lost on me. They thought they were so clever, so strategic in their approach, but they'd forgotten one crucial detail about Harold Mitchell. I hadn't survived the Korean War, built a successful construction business from nothing, and raised a family through 40 years of marriage by being passive or easily fooled. Some lessons, I realized, could only be learned the hard way, and David was about to get the education of his lifetime. The following Saturday arrived gray and drizzling, typical Pacific Northwest weather that Eleanor used to say matched her moods during difficult times. I dressed carefully in my best suit, the navy one she'd helped me pick out for David's wedding 12 years ago, and waited by the front window for their arrival. At exactly 10 o'clock, David's silver sedan pulled into the driveway. I watched through the lace curtains as he and Sarah sat in the car for a moment, no doubt rehearsing their strategy for this visit. Sarah was checking her makeup in the visor mirror while David scrolled through what looked like notes on his phone. They had this all planned out, every word calculated to guide me toward their predetermined conclusion. When I opened the door, their smiles were so bright they could have powered the whole neighborhood. Sarah even hugged me, something she hadn't done since Eleanor's funeral, and I caught a whiff of that expensive perfume she always wore, the kind that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "You look wonderful, Dad," David said, straightening his tie. "Ready for our little adventure?" Little adventure? As if we were going to the zoo instead of touring the place where he wanted to warehouse me for the rest of my days. The drive to Sunset Manor took 25 minutes through the winding roads that led to the newer part of town, where everything looked freshly painted and carefully landscaped. Sarah kept up a steady stream of cheerful chatter about the weather, the fall colors, Anything to fill the silence that might give me time to think too deeply about what we were doing. Sunset Manor sat on a hill overlooking the valley, a sprawling complex of connected buildings designed to look residential rather than institutional. The architecture was pleasant enough, all warm brick and large windows with manicured gardens that probably required a full-time crew to maintain. I had to admit, it looked nothing like the nursing homes I'd imagined. A woman named Patricia greeted us in the lobby, her professional smile as polished as her appearance. She was probably 50, with graying hair styled to suggest wisdom and trustworthiness, wearing a burgundy blazer that screamed administrative authority. Her handshake was firm, her eye contact direct, and her voice carried that practiced warmth of someone who'd given this tour hundreds of times. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm so pleased to meet you. Your son has told me wonderful things about you. I understand you're considering joining our community here at Sunset Manor." "Just exploring options," I replied, noting how David's shoulders relaxed at my cooperative tone. "Taking my time to make an informed decision." Of course. That's exactly the right approach." Patricia gestured toward a seating area decorated with leather furniture and fresh flowers. "Why don't we start with a little overview of what makes Sunset Manor special?" For the next hour, Patricia walked us through the facility with the skill of a seasoned salesperson. She showed us the dining room with its restaurant-quality kitchen, the fitness center with equipment designed for seniors, the library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and comfortable reading nooks. There was a movie theater, a craft room, even a small chapel for residents who wanted to worship without leaving the grounds. The apartments themselves were impressive, I had to admit. The model unit we toured featured a full kitchen, separate bedroom, and living area with large windows that offered views of the surrounding mountains. The bathroom was equipped with safety features that would have made Eleanor's final months much easier: grab bars and a walk-in shower that eliminated the fear of falling. "This particular unit would be perfect for you, Dad," Sarah said, running her hand along the granite countertop. "Look at this kitchen. You could still cook for yourself whenever you wanted, but you'd also have the dining room downstairs when you don't feel like it." David nodded enthusiastically. "And think about the peace of mind, knowing there's medical staff available 24 hours a day. Remember when you had that dizzy spell last month? Here, help would be just a button push away." They were good. I had to give them that. Every concern they raised was legitimate. Every benefit they highlighted was real. If I'd been the confused, overwhelmed widower they thought I was, I might have been convinced. The place was beautiful. The staff seemed caring, and the other residents I'd met during our tour appeared content with their lives here. But I wasn't confused or overwhelmed. I was angry, and I was planning. Patricia quoted the monthly fees with the delicate precision of someone who'd learned to deliver expensive news gently. $5,800 for the apartment we'd seen, with additional charges for various levels of care as they became necessary. David didn't even blink at the numbers, which told me he'd already done the math on selling my house. "We can certainly work with you on the financial arrangements," Patricia continued smoothly. "Many of our residents choose to sell their family homes to fund their stay here. It's actually quite common, and it frees them from the burden of maintaining a large property they no longer need." The burden of maintaining a large property? My home, reduced to a burden in a single sentence. "That's exactly what we were thinking," Sarah said, her voice bright with enthusiasm. "Harold's house is far too big for one person, and the upkeep is becoming overwhelming for someone his age." I smiled and nodded, playing the role of the agreeable old man they expected. "You've all certainly given me a lot to think about. This is a beautiful place, and I can see why people would be happy here." The relief on their faces was almost comical. They thought they'd won, that their careful presentation had achieved its intended result. David squeezed my shoulder in what he probably thought was a gesture of support and affection. "I knew you'd see the wisdom in this, Dad. We just want what's best for you." On the drive home, they chatted excitedly about floor plans and moving timelines, discussing my future as if I wasn't sitting in the back seat listening to every word. Sarah suggested I could move in before Christmas, giving them time to get the house ready for a spring listing when the market would be most favorable. "It's really the perfect solution," she said, turning in her seat to look at me. "You'll have so much less to worry about, and David and I will have peace of mind knowing you're safe and cared for." I made all the right noises, asked all the appropriate questions, played the part of the grateful father who'd finally seen the light. But inside, I was counting down the hours until Monday morning, when the real work would begin. That night, I sat in Eleanor's chair with a cup of tea and my old photo albums, looking through 40 years of memories captured in fading color prints. David's first day of school, standing proud in his new sneakers by our front door. Eleanor in our kitchen, flour in her hair from baking Christmas cookies. Family barbecues in our backyard, birthday parties in our living room, quiet Sunday mornings reading the paper together at our dining room table. Every photograph had been taken in this house, in these rooms, surrounded by the life we'd built together. To David and Sarah, it was just real estate, square footage, and market value. To me, it was everything that mattered, everything that remained of the woman I'd loved for 43 years and the family we'd created together. They wanted to erase all of that for their own convenience and profit. They thought they could manipulate me with guilt and fear, convince me that I was too old and helpless to make my own decisions. Tomorrow, they would learn exactly how wrong they were about Harold Mitchell. I closed the photo album and walked to my bedroom, stopping to look at the framed wedding picture on Eleanor's dresser. We'd been so young then, so full of hope and dreams for the future. She'd have been furious about what David was trying to do and proud of what I was planning in response. Some battles, I realized, were worth fighting regardless of the cost, and this was definitely one of them. Monday morning brought the kind of crisp autumn air that Eleanor had always loved, perfect weather for new beginnings. I was up before dawn, something that had become routine in the 2 years since her passing, but today felt different. Today, I wasn't just going through the motions of another lonely day. Today, I was taking action. My first stop was First National Bank, where I'd done business for over 30 years. Margaret Hendricks, the branch manager, greeted me with the warm familiarity of someone who'd watched me deposit paychecks from my construction company and withdraw funds for David's college tuition. "Harold, what brings you in so early this morning?" she asked, gesturing toward her office. "I need to make some changes to my accounts, Margaret. Some significant changes that require your personal attention." For the next hour, we worked through the details of what Frank Morrison had recommended. I consolidated my savings and checking into a new account, one that would require 2 signatures for any transaction over $500. The second signature would be Frank's, ensuring that no one, not even David with his power of attorney documents that he thought I didn't know about, could access my money without proper legal representation. "Are you sure about this, Harold?" Margaret asked, reviewing the paperwork. "These are pretty restrictive conditions you're placing on your own accounts." "I'm very sure, Margaret. Sometimes a man has to protect himself from people he thought he could trust." She didn't ask for details, but I could see the understanding in her eyes. She'd probably seen similar situations before, families who viewed aging parents as obstacles to be managed rather than people to be respected. Next, I drove to the courthouse, where Frank was waiting with a stack of documents that would change everything. The notary public, a thin woman with kind eyes named Ruth, walked me through each signature, explaining what I was authorizing in language so clear that even David would understand when the time came. The most important document was a trust agreement, something Frank had suggested as the ultimate protection against my son's schemes. By transferring ownership of my house to the Harold and Eleanor Mitchell Family Trust, I maintained complete control over the property while making it impossible for anyone else to sell it without my explicit written consent. "This creates what we call a legal fortress around your home," Frank explained as I signed the final page. "Even if someone were to challenge your mental competency, which they can't because we've had you evaluated by Dr. Patterson, they still couldn't touch the house because it's owned by the trust, not by you personally." The psychological evaluation had been Frank's idea, a preemptive strike against any future claims that I wasn't capable of making my own decisions. Dr. Patterson, a neuropsychologist who specialized in elderly cognitive assessment, had put me through 3 hours of tests that covered everything from basic memory to complex problem solving. The results, which Frank now held in a sealed envelope, would be my insurance policy against David's inevitable accusations. By noon, I was back home, legally armed and dangerous to anyone who thought they could manipulate Harold Mitchell. I made myself a sandwich and sat at my kitchen table, looking around at the familiar surroundings with a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in months. Every cabinet door, every light switch, every window in this house had been touched by Eleanor's hands. David might see dollar signs, but I saw love made tangible. The phone rang at exactly 2:30, right on schedule. David's voice carried that forced cheerfulness that had become so familiar. "Dad, I've been thinking about our visit to Sunset Manor. Sarah and I would love to help you start making arrangements. Maybe we could meet with their financial counselor this week, just to get the paperwork started." I let him talk for several minutes, outlining his timeline for getting me settled in my new home before the holidays. He'd already spoken with a real estate agent, he mentioned casually, just to get a preliminary market analysis of the house. Nothing official, of course, just exploring options. "That sounds wonderful, son," I said when he finally paused for breath. "I'm glad to know you're thinking ahead. Actually, I've been making some arrangements of my own." "Really? What kind of arrangements?" "Well, I met with Frank Morrison this morning. You remember Frank, don't you? He handled the legal work when your mother and I bought this house." There was a slight pause on David's end, the first crack in his confident facade. "Of course I remember Frank. Is everything okay? You're not having legal problems, are you?" "Oh no, nothing like that. I just wanted to make sure all my affairs were in order before making any big decisions about my living situation. You know how your mother always said it's better to be prepared." "That's very responsible of you, Dad." David's voice had taken on a careful quality, like someone walking through a minefield. "What kind of preparations did you make?" I could hear Sarah in the background, asking questions that David was clearly trying to deflect. They hadn't expected this development, and their surprise was almost amusing. "Just some basic estate planning, son, making sure the house and my finances are properly protected. Frank suggested setting up a trust to avoid probate issues down the road. Very common for people my age, apparently." The silence on David's end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all pretense of casual conversation. "Dad, you didn't sign anything without discussing it with us first, did you? These legal matters can be very complicated, and there are people who take advantage of elderly clients who don't understand what they're agreeing to." Elderly clients who don't understand. There it was, the assumption that had driven his entire scheme. In David's mind, I was too old and confused to make my own decisions, a convenient fiction that justified treating me like a child. "I understand perfectly well what I signed, David. Frank explained everything very thoroughly, and I even had an independent evaluation done to make sure my judgment was sound. Dr. Patterson was very complimentary about my mental acuity, actually." Another long pause, followed by muffled conversation between David and Sarah. I could practically hear their panic through the phone line. "Listen, Dad, why don't Sarah and I come over tonight? We can look at whatever paperwork you signed. Make sure everything is in your best interest." I smiled, settling deeper into Eleanor's favorite chair. "That won't be necessary, son. Frank made sure everything was exactly as I wanted it, but I do appreciate your concern." After I hung up, I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at Eleanor's rose garden. The bushes were dormant now, preparing for winter's rest, but come spring they would bloom again with the same beauty that had captivated her for 37 years. That garden, like this house, was worth protecting from people who couldn't see past their own immediate desires. The doorbell rang at 7 o'clock sharp. Through the peephole, I could see David and Sarah standing on my porch, both wearing expressions of barely controlled anxiety. David carried a briefcase, probably filled with documents meant to undo whatever legal protections I'd put in place. "Dad, we need to talk," David said as soon as I opened the door. Sarah was right behind him, her smile strained and artificial. "Of course, come in." I stepped aside, noting how they both scanned the living room as if looking for evidence of my supposed mental decline. "We've been thinking about our conversation this afternoon," Sarah began, settling onto the couch with the careful precision of someone choosing their words carefully. "We're concerned that you might have made some hasty decisions without fully considering all the implications." David opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with papers. "I brought some information about trust arrangements that might be more suitable for your situation. Some of these legal setups can be quite restrictive, and you might find yourself unable to access your own money when you need it." I sat across from them in my recliner, the same spot where I'd received countless visits over the years. Birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings, quiet evenings when David would bring his homework to my table and Eleanor would help him with math problems. Now he sat in my living room trying to convince me that I was too incompetent to manage my own affairs. "I appreciate your concern, but Frank made sure I understood exactly what I was agreeing to. The trust gives me complete control over the house and my finances while protecting both from any future complications. What kind of complications? Sarah's voice had an edge now, the polite facade beginning to slip. Oh, unscrupulous people who might try to take advantage of an elderly widower. People who might pressure someone into making decisions that benefit them more than the person they claim to care about. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. David's face flushed red, while Sarah went pale. They finally understood that I knew exactly what they'd been planning. Dad, I think you're misunderstanding our motivations here. David's voice carried a note of desperation now. We're not trying to take advantage of you. We're trying to help you make smart decisions about your future. Are you? I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. Because from where I sit, it looks like you've been planning to sell my house out from under me and use the money to buy yourselves a lake house. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, while David stared at me with the expression of someone whose world had just shifted beneath his feet. How did you... David started, then stopped, realizing that any explanation would only confirm what I'd already discovered. I may be 74, son, but I'm not deaf, blind, or stupid. I heard your wife talking to her sister about pricing the house to move fast so you could close on your lake property. I know you've already contacted a real estate agent for a market analysis. I know you see me as an obstacle to be removed rather than a father to be respected. Sarah found her voice first, though it came out smaller than usual. Harold, you're taking things out of context. We never said we were going to force you to sell the house. No. You just planned to manipulate me into agreeing by convincing me I was too old and helpless to live here safely. Then you'd swoop in as my concerned children, generously offering to handle all the complicated details of selling my home and managing my money. David stood up abruptly, his professional composure finally cracking completely. This is ridiculous. You're paranoid and suspicious, seeing conspiracies where there aren't any. Maybe we were right to be concerned about your mental state. And there it was. The accusation I'd been expecting. When manipulation failed, the next step was always to question the victim's sanity. I stood up as well, feeling taller and stronger than I had in months. If you're questioning my mental state, David, I have some documents you might find interesting. I walked to my desk and pulled out the sealed envelope Dr. Patterson had given me that morning. The psychological evaluation Frank had recommended as protection against exactly this kind of accusation. Comprehensive cognitive assessment performed this morning by Dr. Patricia Patterson, a board-certified neuropsychologist. Would you like me to read you the summary, or can you manage it yourself? David took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, scanning the contents while Sarah read over his shoulder. I watched their faces change as they absorbed Dr. Patterson's conclusions. Mentally sharp, emotionally stable, fully capable of making independent decisions about his living situation and financial affairs. This doesn't change anything, Sarah said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. You're still living alone in a house that's too big for you, with no family nearby if something goes wrong. You're absolutely right, Sarah. I am living alone, and it is a big house. But it's my house, filled with my memories, and I'll decide what happens to it and when. I walked to the front door and opened it, the October evening air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from neighboring chimneys. I think it's time for you both to go home now. Take your documents and your concerns and your plans for my future, and leave me to live my life the way I choose. They gathered their papers in silence, the briefcase that was supposed to contain my salvation now feeling like the weight of their defeat. David paused at the threshold, looking back at me with something that might have been regret. Dad, we really were trying to help. Maybe we went about it wrong, but we do care about you. I'm sure you do, son. But caring about someone means respecting their choices, not manipulating them into doing what you think is best. After they left, I stood in my doorway watching their taillights disappear down the street. The house felt different around me, not empty or lonely as it had for the past 2 years, but strong and secure. Eleanor's presence seemed to fill every room, her approval warming me like sunlight through the windows she'd dressed with such care. I walked back to my chair and picked up the phone, dialing Frank's home number. When he answered, I could hear his grandchildren playing in the background, the sound of a family gathering for an ordinary Monday evening. Frank, it's Harold. I wanted you to know that your legal fortress worked exactly as planned. I'm glad to hear it, Harold. How did they take the news? About as well as you'd expect. Lots of bluster about my mental state and their good intentions, but the psychological evaluation shut that down pretty quickly. Frank chuckled softly. Amazing how concerned people become about your competency when they can't get what they want from you. What's your next move? I looked around my living room, at the family photos on Eleanor's piano, at the bookshelf filled with volumes we'd collected over 4 decades, at the fireplace where we'd spent countless winter evenings reading together. I'm going to live my life, Frank, in my own house, on my own terms for as long as I'm able. And if David and Sarah can't respect that decision, then that's their loss, not mine. The battle was won, but I knew the war wasn't over. David and Sarah would regroup, probably consulting their own lawyers about ways to challenge the trust or my mental capacity. But I was ready for whatever came next. The scared, lonely widower they thought they were manipulating was gone, replaced by a man who remembered his own strength. Some lessons, I reflected, could only be learned through experience. And David was about to get an education in respecting his elders that would last him the rest of his life. 2 months passed in relative peace. David and Sarah made no further attempts to contact me directly, though I occasionally caught sight of their car driving slowly past my house, as if they were conducting surveillance on their defeated enemy. I'd taken to waving cheerfully from my front window whenever I spotted them, a gesture that probably infuriated them more than any angry confrontation could have. Spring arrived early that year, and Eleanor's rose garden responded with an explosion of color that took my breath away. I spent my mornings tending to the plants she'd loved so much, talking to her memory as I pruned and watered and fertilized. The neighbors probably thought I was losing my mind, but I didn't care. Some conversations transcend the boundaries between life and death, and mine with Eleanor were more meaningful than anything I'd shared with the living in years. It was during one of these garden sessions that I noticed the moving truck parked 3 houses down. New neighbors were moving into the Patterson place, which had been empty since old Bill Patterson passed away last winter. I watched from behind my rose bushes as a young couple directed the movers, their excitement palpable even from a distance. The woman was pregnant, probably in her 2nd trimester, and her husband fussed over her constantly, making sure she wasn't lifting anything heavy or standing in the sun too long. They reminded me of Eleanor and myself 40 years ago, young and hopeful and ready to build a life together in this neighborhood. That evening, I baked one of Eleanor's famous apple pies and walked down to introduce myself, carrying the dessert in the same ceramic dish my wife had used for countless welcome gifts over the decades. The couple turned out to be Mark and Jennifer Chen, both teachers at the local elementary school. Mark taught 4th grade while Jennifer handled kindergarten, and they were expecting their first child in September. Their enthusiasm was infectious as they showed me through their new home, pointing out features they planned to improve and spaces they imagined filling with children's laughter. "Mr. Mitchell," Jennifer said as I prepared to leave, "would you like to join us for dinner sometime this week? We'd love to hear stories about the neighborhood, and Mark makes an incredible lasagna." I accepted gratefully, realizing how long it had been since anyone had invited me to share a meal that didn't come with ulterior motives. The following Thursday, I found myself sitting at their kitchen table, regaling them with tales of 40 years in this community while savoring the best Italian food I'd tasted since Eleanor's passing. During dessert, Mark mentioned that they were looking for someone to check on their house occasionally when they traveled to visit family. Nothing major, just collecting mail and making sure everything looked lived in while they were away. The pay would be modest but regular, and it would give them peace of mind knowing a trusted neighbor was keeping an eye on things. "I'd love to help," I told them, meaning every word. "It's been too long since I felt useful to anyone." That night, I called Frank to update him on David and Sarah's continued surveillance and my new friendship with the Chens. He listened with the patience of someone who'd become more than just my lawyer over the past few months. "Harold, I've been thinking about your situation," he said when I'd finished my update. "Have you considered what you want to happen to the house when you're gone? The trust protects it while you're alive, but you'll need to specify your wishes for after your death." The question caught me off guard. In all my planning to protect the house from David's immediate schemes, I hadn't thought much about its ultimate fate. Eleanor and I had always assumed it would go to our son, back when we believed he would cherish it as we had. "What are my options, Frank?" "Well, you could leave it to David with conditions attached, requiring him to live in it for a certain period or prohibiting him from selling it immediately. You could donate it to a charitable organization that would use it for housing families in need. You could even sell it yourself and donate the proceeds to causes you care about. Or, Frank continued with a slight smile in his voice, you could leave it to someone who would appreciate it the way you and Eleanor did. Someone who understands that a home is more than just a financial asset. I thought about Mark and Jennifer, about the way their eyes had lit up when they talked about raising their children in this neighborhood, about how they'd asked respectful questions about my garden and listened with genuine interest to my stories about the community's history, about how they'd invited me to dinner simply because they enjoyed my company, not because they wanted something from me. That's an interesting thought, Frank. Let me consider my options. Over the next few weeks, I found myself spending more time with the Chens than I had with anyone since Eleanor's death. Mark helped me repair a section of fence that had been damaged in the winter storms, while Jennifer taught me to use a smartphone so I could stay connected with the world beyond my garden. In return, I shared 40 years of neighborhood wisdom, from which contractors could be trusted to where the best grocery deals could be found. It was Jennifer who first noticed the car parked across from my house on Tuesday afternoons, the same silver sedan that belonged to David and Sarah. She mentioned it casually while we were planting vegetables in her backyard, but I could hear the concern in her voice. Mr. Mitchell, is everything okay with your family? I've seen that car a few times, and the people inside seem to be watching your house. I explained the situation as diplomatically as possible, not wanting to burden her with the full extent of my son's betrayal. But Jennifer was perceptive, and she read between the lines with the skill of someone who'd spent years managing classroom dynamics. That must be so difficult for you, she said softly. Family relationships can be complicated, especially when money is involved. Mark and I have seen similar situations with some of our students' grandparents, adult children who think they know what's best, but forget that their parents are still capable of making their own decisions. Her understanding meant more to me than she could have known. For months, I'd felt isolated by David's assumptions about my competency, as if his doubts had somehow infected my own self-perception. Having someone young and intelligent treat me as an equal restored something I hadn't realized I'd lost. The next Tuesday, when David and Sarah's car appeared for its weekly surveillance, I was ready. I walked across the street with a plate of Jennifer's homemade cookies and tapped on their passenger window. Sarah nearly jumped out of her skin, while David's face cycled through surprise, embarrassment, and finally resignation. Beautiful afternoon for a drive, I said cheerfully as Sarah reluctantly lowered the window. Would you like some cookies? Jennifer made them fresh this morning. Dad, what are you doing? David's voice carried the strained patience of someone caught in an embarrassing situation. I live here, son. The question is, what are you doing parked across from my house every Tuesday at 3 o'clock? Sarah found her voice first, though it came out higher than usual. We were just concerned about you, Harold, making sure you're managing okay on your own. I'm managing wonderfully, thank you. In fact, I've made some lovely new friends in the neighborhood. The Chens, 3 houses down. Lovely young couple, both teachers. They've been helping me with various projects around the house. The mention of help from others seemed to agitate David more than anything else I could have said. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he processed this information. What kind of help, he asked, suspicion coloring every word. Oh, Mark helped me fix that section of fence that's been bothering me for months. Jennifer taught me to use one of those smartphones so I can stay connected with the world. They even invite me for dinner occasionally. It's nice to feel useful again. I could see the wheels turning in David's head, probably wondering if these new friends posed some threat to his eventual inheritance. The irony wasn't lost on me that his concern about my vulnerability to manipulation applied only when others were involved, not when he was the one doing the manipulating. We should meet them, Sarah said suddenly. These neighbors of yours, make sure they're trustworthy people. I smiled broadly, as if this were the most wonderful suggestion I'd heard all day. What a marvelous idea. I'll invite you all for dinner this weekend. Jennifer makes an incredible pot roast, and Mark has been wanting to hear more stories about the neighborhood's history. You could share some of your memories from when you were growing up here, David. The trapped expression on my son's face told me he'd realized too late that his wife's suggestion had backfired spectacularly. The last thing they wanted was to sit through a social evening where I appeared happy, healthy, and surrounded by people who treated me with respect. Actually, we're quite busy this weekend, David said quickly. Maybe some other time. Of course, I replied, still maintaining my cheerful demeanor. Well, I should let you get back to your drive. Enjoy those cookies. I walked back to my house with a spring in my step that I hadn't felt in years. Through my front window, I watched their car sit motionless for another 5 minutes before finally driving away. They wouldn't be back the following Tuesday, I was certain. Nothing deflated surveillance quite like being cheerfully acknowledged by your target. That evening, I called Frank with another update. He listened to my account of the afternoon's encounter with obvious amusement, chuckling at several points during my description of David and Sarah's discomfort. "Harold, you're handling this perfectly. By building new relationships and maintaining your independence, you're demonstrating exactly what they claimed you couldn't do. Living alone and thriving while doing it. Frank, I've been thinking more about our conversation regarding the house's future. I'd like to schedule another meeting to discuss some specific ideas I've been considering." "Excellent. How about Thursday morning? I'll have my secretary prepare some options for you to review." After we hung up, I walked through my house slowly, seeing it with fresh eyes once again. But this time, instead of remembering only the past, I found myself imagining its future. Mark and Jennifer's children running through these same hallways where David had played 40 years ago. Birthday parties in the living room, Christmas mornings by the fireplace, quiet evenings in Eleanor's chair with bedtime stories and homework help. The house deserved to be filled with love again, not sold off to fund someone else's vacation property. David had made his choice when he decided to treat me like an obstacle rather than his father. Now I would make mine, and it would be a choice that honored both the past I'd built with Eleanor and the future I could still influence. Some gifts, I realized, were meant to be earned through respect and appreciation, not inherited through blood alone. And some lessons could only be learned when the consequences were real and irreversible. Thursday morning would bring new possibilities, and for the first time since Eleanor's death, I was genuinely excited about what lay ahead. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of sunshine that Eleanor always claimed was heaven's way of blessing important decisions. I dressed carefully in my good gray suit and walked to Frank's office with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since the day I'd signed my first construction contract 43 years ago. Frank had prepared a comprehensive array of estate planning documents, each option laid out with the meticulous attention to detail that had made him the most trusted lawyer in our community. But my mind was already made up. The events of the past few months had crystallized something that had been forming since that first manipulative phone call from David. "Harold, before we discuss the specifics," Frank said, settling behind his mahogany desk, "I want you to understand that whatever decision you make today can be changed later if circumstances warrant it. Estate planning isn't carved in stone." "I appreciate that, Frank, but I don't think I'll be changing my mind. David made his choice when he decided I was too incompetent to live in my own home. Now I'm making mine." For the next 2 hours, we worked through the details of a plan that would have made Eleanor proud. The Harold and Eleanor Mitchell Family Trust would continue protecting the house during my lifetime, but upon my death, ownership would transfer not to my son, but to a housing foundation that would ensure the property served families who truly needed it. Specifically, the house would become part of the Teachers' Housing Initiative, providing affordable accommodation for young educators starting their careers in our community. Mark and Jennifer would have the first option to purchase it at below market value, with the understanding that they would maintain Eleanor's garden and preserve the home's character for future generations. The remaining proceeds from the eventual sale would establish a scholarship fund in Eleanor's name, helping other young couples achieve the dream of homeownership that she and I had fought so hard to realize decades ago. "This is a beautiful legacy, Harold," Frank said as I signed the final documents. "Eleanor would be so proud of what you're creating here. She always said that houses were meant to shelter love, not generate profit. This way, our home will continue doing what it was always meant to do." The legal paperwork was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, I began preparing the house itself for its future role. I spent hours organizing Eleanor's belongings, deciding which items held enough sentimental value to keep and which could be donated to families who would appreciate them. Her china set went to the church auxiliary for their community dinners. Her extensive cookbook collection found a new home with Jennifer, who promised to try every recipe and think of Eleanor while she cooked. The quilts she'd sewn by hand were distributed among the elderly residents at Sunset Manor, providing comfort to people who understood their true value. But it was Eleanor's jewelry box that presented the most difficult decision. David had always assumed those pieces would eventually go to Sarah, despite the fact that his wife had shown little interest in Eleanor's simple, elegant taste. The engagement ring I'd saved 6 months to afford, the pearl necklace that had been Eleanor's mother's, the small gold locket containing our wedding photo. Jennifer noticed my hesitation when I was sorting through these treasures one afternoon. We'd fallen into a comfortable routine of her stopping by after school to help with various tasks, and her presence made the emotional work more bearable. "Mr. Mitchell, those are beautiful pieces. Your wife had exquisite taste." She did indeed. I held up the pearl necklace, remembering how it had caught the light during our last anniversary dinner. David's wife never appreciated Eleanor's jewelry, called it old-fashioned and outdated. Jennifer's expression softened with understanding. Sometimes the most precious things aren't appreciated by the people we expect to value them. I made my decision in that moment. "Jennifer, would you do me the honor of accepting these?" Eleanor always said that jewelry should be worn by someone who understands its beauty, not locked away in a drawer gathering dust. Her eyes filled with tears as she realized what I was offering. "Mr. Mitchell, I couldn't possibly accept something so valuable. These should go to your family." "You are my family now, Jennifer. You and Mark have shown me more genuine care in 6 months than my own son has in 6 years. Eleanor would want her jewelry worn by someone who appreciates love over luxury." The transformation of the house continued through the summer. Mark helped me convert Eleanor's sewing room into a small nursery, painting the walls a cheerful yellow and installing safety features that would protect their coming child. Jennifer organized the extensive library that Eleanor and I had accumulated over 4 decades, creating a reading nook that would inspire future generations to discover the magic of books. But it was the garden that became our most ambitious project. Eleanor's roses were thriving under my continued care, but the vegetable patch had been neglected since her death. Together, we restored it to its former glory, planting tomatoes and peppers, herbs and flowers, creating a space where children could learn about growth and patience and the satisfaction of nurturing living things. David and Sarah's surveillance had ended after that awkward encounter with the cookies, but I occasionally received phone calls that grew increasingly desperate as they realized their plans were unraveling beyond repair. "Dad, I heard from Margaret at the bank that you've been making some unusual financial arrangements," David said during one particularly tense conversation in July. "Are you sure you're thinking clearly about all this? Maybe we should sit down with a financial advisor and review your decisions." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, son. And I have been working with advisors, people who understand that my money should serve my values, not someone else's ambitions." "But what about my inheritance? What about the house Mom and I grew up in?" "The house will continue serving families who need it, just as it served us. As for your inheritance, you made your choice when you decided I was incompetent to manage my own affairs. Actions have consequences, David, something I apparently failed to teach you properly when you were young." The calls became less frequent after that, though I heard through neighborhood gossip that David and Sarah had consulted several attorneys about challenging my mental capacity or the validity of the trust. Each inquiry led to the same conclusion. Dr. Patterson's evaluation was ironclad, Frank's legal work was impeccable, and my rights as a property owner were absolute. By September, when Jennifer and Mark's son was born, the house had been completely transformed from a monument to past grief into a celebration of future possibilities. Little Thomas Chen filled the rooms with sounds that had been absent since David's childhood, cries and laughter, and the gentle murmur of parents discovering the overwhelming joy of new life. I became Uncle Harold to Thomas, spending my days helping with childcare while Mark and Jennifer returned to their teaching duties. The baby seemed to find my weathered hands and gravelly voice soothing, often falling asleep in my arms while I told him stories about his neighborhood's history and the woman who would have loved him like her own grandson. One October afternoon, exactly a year after David's first manipulative phone call, I was sitting on my front porch with Thomas sleeping in his carrier beside me when that familiar silver sedan appeared at the end of the street. But this time, instead of parking for surveillance, it pulled directly into my driveway. David emerged alone, his face bearing the weight of 12 months of frustration and defeat. Sarah remained in the car, probably afraid to face the man whose life she'd tried to restructure for her own benefit. "Dad, we need to talk," David said, climbing the porch steps with the heavy tread of someone carrying an enormous burden. Of course, son, have a seat, but keep your voice down. Thomas is sleeping and Jennifer will have my head if we wake him. David's eyes widened as he noticed the baby carrier, then traveled around the porch, taking in the obvious signs of family life that had replaced the lonely isolation he'd expected to find. Children's toys in the yard, a second car in the driveway that belonged to Mark and Jennifer, the sound of laughter drifting from the backyard where Jennifer was hanging laundry. "Whose baby is that?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Thomas Chen, born 6 weeks ago. Mark and Jennifer are living here now, helping me maintain the house and providing the kind of family atmosphere your mother always wanted." The words hit David like physical blows. "Living here? But this is our family home. They can't just move in and take over." "They're not taking over anything, David. They're sharing a home with someone who appreciates their company. Something you chose not to do when you decided I was too much of a burden for your lifestyle." "We never said you were a burden, Dad. We were concerned about your safety, your ability to maintain this big house alone." I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 75 years, but also feeling stronger than I had in decades. "David, I'm going to tell you something your mother would have said if she were still here. Love isn't about making convenient arrangements for the people you claim to care about. Love is about respecting their choices, even when those choices don't serve your immediate interests." Thomas stirred in his carrier, and I automatically began rocking it gently, the motion as natural as breathing after months of practice. David watched this interaction with growing realization of everything he'd lost through his manipulation and greed. "What happens to the house now, Dad? When you're gone, what happens to everything Mom and I built here?" "The house will continue serving families who need it, just as it served us. There's a foundation that will ensure it provides affordable housing for young teachers, people like Mark and Jennifer, who understand that a home is more than a financial investment." David's face went white as the full implications hit him. "You're giving away my inheritance to strangers. I'm ensuring that your mother's legacy lives on through love and service, instead of being sold off to fund someone else's vacation property. You forfeited any claim to this house when you tried to manipulate me into abandoning it. But I'm your son. Doesn't that mean anything?" "Being my son means everything, David. That's why this hurts so much. You could have been part of this new family I've created here. Mark and Jennifer would have welcomed you, just as they've welcomed me. But you chose manipulation over relationship, greed over love." Thomas began to fuss, and I lifted him from his carrier, cradling him against my chest with the practiced ease of someone who'd found new purpose in old age. The baby's cries stopped immediately, replaced by the contented sounds of an infant who felt safe and loved. "This is what family looks like, son. Not financial arrangements or convenient solutions, but people choosing to care for each other without expecting anything in return." David sat in silence for several minutes, watching me comfort a child who wasn't related to me by blood, but who trusted me completely. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Is there any way to fix this, Dad? Any way to earn back what I've lost?" I looked at my son, seeing glimpses of the boy I'd raised mixed with the calculating man he'd become under Sarah's influence. The answer wasn't simple, and it wouldn't satisfy his desire for easy restoration of his privileges. "David, you can't undo the choices you've made or erase the trust you've broken. But you can start making different choices going forward. You can learn to value relationships over real estate, love over money." "What does that mean practically?" "It means accepting that your inheritance isn't guaranteed, that it must be earned through respect and genuine care. It means understanding that I've built a new family here, one based on mutual support rather than financial obligation. You can be part of that family if you're willing to change your priorities. And if I'm not willing, then you'll continue living with the consequences of treating your father like a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved." David left that afternoon without making any commitments, but something in his expression suggested that my words had penetrated deeper than his previous stubborn resistance. Whether he would act on that understanding remained to be seen, but I'd done my part in offering him a path back to genuine relationship. That evening, as Mark and Jennifer prepared dinner in the kitchen that had once echoed with my lonely footsteps, I sat in Eleanor's chair watching Thomas sleep in his bouncy seat. The house hummed with the sounds of family life, conversations about the day's events, plans for the weekend, the comfortable domestic rhythm that Eleanor and I had cherished for 40 years. Frank called as we were finishing dessert, his voice carrying news that brought a smile to my face. "Harold, I thought you'd want to know that David and Sarah consulted with 3 different attorneys this week about challenging your estate planning. All 3 firms gave them the same advice. Your documentation is bulletproof, and any legal challenge would be both expensive and futile." "I'm not surprised, Frank. You do excellent work." There's more. Apparently, Sarah became quite agitated during the final consultation, making some rather unflattering comments about your mental state and your new living arrangements. The attorney suggested that her attitude might actually work against them if they chose to proceed with any legal action. The irony was perfect. Sarah's own greed and contempt had become the strongest evidence of her unsuitability as someone who deserved to inherit Eleanor's legacy. Her inability to hide her true nature had sealed her fate more effectively than any legal strategy Frank could have devised. As I hung up the phone, Jennifer approached with Thomas in her arms. The baby was wide awake, studying my face with the intense curiosity of someone discovering the world one person at a time. "Mr. Mitchell, Mark and I have been talking, and we want you to know how grateful we are for everything you've done for us. Not just the house, but the way you've welcomed us into your family. You've given me far more than I've given you, Jennifer. You've given me purpose again, and joy, and the chance to see this house filled with love once more." Thomas reached out with one tiny hand, grasping my finger with surprising strength. In that simple gesture, I saw the future Eleanor and I had dreamed of when we first walked through these empty rooms 41 years ago. Not the specific future we'd imagined, but something even better. A legacy of love that would outlast both our lives and continue blessing families for generations to come. The house would survive, not as David's inheritance to be liquidated for profit, but as Eleanor's true memorial, sheltering love and nurturing dreams exactly as she would have wanted. And I would spend my remaining years not as a burden to be managed, but as a grandfather figure to children who would grow up knowing that home meant more than square footage and market value. Some victories, I reflected as Thomas's eyes grew heavy with approaching sleep, were worth more than money could ever measure. And some lessons, no matter how painful, were exactly what ungrateful children needed to learn. David might never understand what he'd lost through his manipulation and greed, but Thomas would grow up in a house where love was the only currency that mattered. That seemed like justice enough for this old man who'd finally learned the difference between being used and being valued. The safe in my basement, forgotten by everyone including myself until this moment of perfect clarity, would remain my final secret. A testament to the fact that the most valuable things in life could never be stolen, sold, or inherited. They could only be earned through love, respect, and the patient daily choice to treat others as precious rather than profitable. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.